All right, welcome to Resilient Voices and Beyond. I'm so excited to have another episode for here for you guys. This is a very special guest. I'm honored to have him on. He's done a lot of work, and for even for myself, just role modeling, advocacy and bringing awareness to the child welfare arena and for youth and alumni. So without further ado, I'm gonna have him introduce himself. Um, Go ahead.
Hey everyone, my name is Sixto. I'm excited to be on the podcast today. I'm excited to be able to talk about not just Think of Us, but just what does it mean to be an alumni also. I've come to this work by my lived experience in care, and that's what started my passion to do this work.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It's such an honor, and I can't say it enough. I appreciate you taking out some time to be able to be here today. Um, my first question for you is, can you give us a picture of what your experience was like, and how did that flow?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, what I learned later in life that a bit of my experience was different than the most of the young people come into care. About half of the folks who come into foster care actually leave and get reunited. But there are those of us who stay in and or those of us who get adopted. And I first came into care when I was 11 months old. And at the age of 6 I was able to go live with my biological mother for a year, but 11 months and 3 weeks later, I found myself back in the foster care system. It was after that where I was adopted at the age of 9. And that adoption was not the forever home that I had thought I would be a part of, right? In fact, it was very abusive. It was very racist. While the other kids who were white skinned got to go to a private school, I was told because I was a black skinned person that I had to go to a public school. And so by 13, I was couch surfing. By 15, I had to do a series of things like journal and tape record the abuse I was going through just to get back into the system. And when I got back into the system, I thought that it was the end of the storm, but it was just the beginning of that second storm on that journey to age out, which I ended up doing and moving to Richmond, Virginia from Connecticut to be able to go to college to do so.
Thank you for that. Wow, I've been doing this, for a couple episodes now, and it's always interesting to hear the different stories and journey that my guests go through, and it's just I feel very connected to your story, having to go through that sense of racism early on, in your life, that kind of relates to my experience, but kind of just just something kind of more in detail with that experience. You had experience only in foster homes? Were there group homes or CCIs of any in that journey towards aging out?
No, I was so petrified to be in a group home because my little brother had been in a group home. And I remember literally walking up to the facility and there being these tall gates, these barbed
Mhm.
wires on top of them, a police car that said Department of Children and Family, police, going through the gate,
Wow.
being pat down, having to have one door open and then hearing that clink and then have another door open and getting to the other side. Like those were the moments where I just really, it was so clear to me, like, I never want to live in a group home. And so when I was being removed, right, from the homes that I was in, I would tell my worker and I would tell folks, if you remove me and try to put me in a group home, I'm gonna run away. Or if you remove me, I'm going to release the tapes of this abuse. And so I was one who was very adamant about never being placed in a group home.
Wow. Wow. I can tell you, from my own experience being in over 20 different residential facilities myself, um, it was prison. It was a place of prison, and it kind of resonates for the listeners that's listening to this. That is not an exaggeration. It literally, is set up like a correctional facility, and this is for children. But thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you
Now,
too. And I just want to note and recognize, like, no child should have to be raised in over 20 different residentials. At that point, what's supposed to be an intervention is, I would borderline say, without the right credentials, I would consider that malpractice.
definitely, definitely, um, definitely. And to speak to that, because I know that's another piece of some of the advocacy that you and I think of us have done is around bringing awareness with CCIs and residentials and so forth and what they're doing and just advocating for that to change. Um, and I appreciate that, because I remember I remember coming out of those places, even when I was in there and doing home visits, not knowing that I could sit down, pacing back and forth. I was very institutionalized by the time I aged out, and I had to unlearn and undo all that amongst trying to, before I could even go to the part of my healing experience with the trauma, I had to try to normalize myself in society. So that I can resonate with that very well. My next question here for you is you said that you aged out. So can you give me a picture of what that looked like 17, 16, 17, 18 into adulthood, for yourself? What was there any supports then? Like were there anyone kind of like what we have here in the state of Michigan is like family team meetings where there's your caseworker and everybody that come together and make a plan. Did that happen for you?
Yeah, so I say, my journey to aging out started immediately at the age of 15 when I was re-entered into the system. And people, basically, there was this notion in conversation like, look, chances of adoption are probably low. You don't want adoption anyway. And I was very adamant, like, just came from a failed adoption, that probably wasn't going to be my story. And so it was about getting enrolled in the workforce learning program, where I got to go to the youth business center and learn how to like literally show up to a job that they gave me. And it was basically designing mouse pads, right? But during that program, we would also get like life skill training. And so did that. But I was also the board chair at one point of the youth board for the Department of Children and Families. And that's when I learned all these statistics about how only 3% of young people at the time, according to the Midwest study, get a 4-year degree. And I was petrified because what I did know as a high school student was I knew that two things about college. It was the way out the hood, and it was the way that to not be homeless. And so at the time, it was 2008, the financial crisis was going on, and the state was talking about cutting the bachelor's program, the college support programs that it had for foster youth. So the state gives us to in Connecticut gave us tuition support, and they had just cut the master's tuition support, and they were looking at the bachelor's one. And so there was this big fear between me and the young people at that time that there actually wouldn't be money to go to college. And so I was always in the last 2.5 years of high school, I was in this state of constant worry about what was going to happen to me, what was going to happen after high school, what would life be like if I didn't get support from the state to be able to pay for school, and was starting to plan towards that. And so some of the things I did was, one, I like made a big deal about SAT prep, because I had not the best SAT scores. And so, worked with my teachers to set up a after school program where me and other foster youth from the nearby cities got to go and together do SAT prep together. I was able to do college tours. I was able to go ahead and participate in different activities that were related to the life skill programs that were there, just to prepare. And some of those were like participate in budgeting classes, participating in a match savings program where I got to, for every dollar I saved, I got to save $1. And it was those type of programs that helped me be prepared. But more importantly than helping me be prepared tactically, right, for the technical execution,
Mhm.
was that I associated with older alumni. And I remember, the board chair before me in the youth board was Kwani. And, remember going to her apartment and thinking to myself, where is all your furniture when she had just moved in? And and that was the moment it clicked to me like, oh, I really need to take this match saving program serious. I really need to take some of these programs serious because I see the result of not. And so both the inspiration of seeing young people who were transitioning who had and young people who didn't, like that reality check was so real that it allowed me to like really take advantages of those services.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you for that. And may I ask, the program you was part of, it sounds very similar to a program I have here in Michigan called MYOY. Is it the Jim Casey program?
So
Um,
So yes, I was fortunate enough to be in foster care in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and it was one of the 17 sites that Jim Case Youth Opportunity Initiative has.
mhm.
And one of them is in Michigan around the match saving programs and Keys to Our Future financial literacy coaching program. I think to myself all the time, like these were the programs that were instrumental to me. And unfortunately, being born in a different zip code, being born in a different part of the country would have meant that I would not have gotten access to that.
Definitely. And it was another thing that you touched on, like, during that period, what you had known is how to get out of the hood and how to not be homeless. If you don't mind, can you speak a little bit more to that? Because I want to make sure that my audience understand, and I can kind of speak to a little bit of my experience growing up in being raised in Detroit, Michigan, where it's known throughout the whole entire country what Detroit is and the chaos that's within it. There's a survival mode on top of the abuse or the neglect or whatever led you to be in the system to make it out. So I'm curious to understand that from your point of view. Um, when did that kind of sit into your mindset that I needed something different?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a very young age, even in elementary school, I knew I was the other. And so I didn't fit in with the folks who decided to be part of like, even in like elementary school, sixth grade, middle school, like the little gangs that quote gangs that, folks would get into. It was
Mhm.
just not my cup of tea, not my ministry. And so, and so I was just not that hard. And so I wasn't part of those groups, and I didn't want that lifestyle. I have seen friends, middle school and up, be murdered. I have seen people not on their surf anymore, and it was clear to me like I've always felt like I had a different calling. And so the one way I did see people leaving the hood was college. I remember my adoptive sister, it was my adopted mother's biological daughter. She had gotten a full ride to UConn. And she did the first 2 years at the community college version of UConn because at the satellite campuses, because she was part of the household and she helped maintain the household. She helped drive her around to get groceries and all those things. And so it was hard for her to leave. But when she was about to leave, there was this big fight in the house. And it was this moment where she had like packed all her stuff up. My adopted mother tried to take a hammer and like bash out the windows from the Jeep that she was driving, but I was able to get the hammer out of her hand. And there was just this big commotion, this big altercation. But at the end of the day, her daughter got in that car and drove off and went to college, completed that degree, and escaped that house of abuse, escaped the hood, escaped this whole entire lifestyle. And in that very moment, I think, some of the other folks in the house may have felt like, we were abandoned by her, but I was glad for her. I was happy she was out. And I was like, this is how I'm going to get out too.
Thank you for that. And just this is I'm gonna ask this question again a little bit later, but specific to this topic, to people that are in our situations and so forth. Some of us click on like this is not what I want for my life. I don't want to be, and even instance, I don't want to be like my parents. I don't want to be like the examples that have been presented before me. I want to be different. So kind of to attest to that, what advice do you have for those people who are trying to get help in their situation? Is it the best, whether there's abuse or neglect happening, and so forth? What advice do you have for those people?
Yeah, I would say the first thing, that has to happen is your basic needs have to be met. You have to position yourself in a way that you're stable in terms of housing, that, you have gotten the training, whether that be college or other, to be able to get enough income to come into your household. And then to be able to live within your means in that household is so incredibly important, because healing cannot happen when you're in survival mode. And
Mhm.
as long as we are still in survival mode and have to deal with trying to meet our basic needs, you don't enter that stage. But there does come a point in our lives where, we do get to that basic needs are being met. We have our own apartment, we have our own house, we have our transportation, we have our own job. But then the work becomes finding enough value when you have experienced people devaluing you. There is something that I believe that happens when you go from one home and you're told you're loved and you're told you are cared for and you're told that you're part of the family, but then your stuff is in a trash bag, and then you're at the next home, and then you're at the next place. And I do believe that it does have an effect on our own ability, our own self-worth at one point, and that it takes some of us longer than others or quicker than others, right, to be able to build that self-worth back up. But when we find that self-worth and we find that self-love and we start being able to move from that survival to start living, like that is truly where healing starts to begin. It took me a very long time. I'm almost 30 next month. And it is only now that I can look at pictures of me in my teenage years, in my baby years, and smile and think of the resiliency I've had over my life trajectory, and that I have made it in spite of. But for a very long time, those pictures were tucked away and not visible because of the pain that it actually caused.
Wow, thank you for that. That was very powerful, and I appreciate that. Wasn't one of my original questions, but I felt because of what we were talking about in that topic, it's important. As people, they're saying people of color that has made it out, to be able to provide those tips and advice to those people of color, and I'm going to say people of color because a big percentage of people who come in care is those Black and brown youth and so forth. So a lot of them tend to be, in the case where they're asking for help, they're telling people about the abuse, and for some reason they're not being heard, and not everybody gets the opportunity to go and care. Some people end up staying in those situations, because there's not enough evidence to remove them, and so forth. So thought it was important to be able to get that advice, and so forth. But I'm gonna switch gears here, um, so can you give me a little bit of an outline of how did Think of Us come about? Like, how did you navigate to that?
Oh, so, when I first started Think of Us, it was not because I wanted to start an organization. It was literally because I got so frustrated with being part of all of these different type of, organizations, advocacy boards, national ones, local ones, and not being heard. And I feel like one of the things that was happening, in that time frame about 10 years ago was that we were being engaged as people with lived experience, but it was always in the effort to push someone else's agenda.
Mm,
But what was the agenda and what was the interventions that, we wanted to see as people with lived experience, and how did that actually get pushed forward? And there's a difference, there's a big nuance between the agenda that aligns with us already and the agenda that we create. So yes, I would love to see, match savings accounts, better permanency for older youth and so forth. And so when organizations would engage me, it's like, yeah, I agree with that. Of course I want to do that. And it feels like authentic, but there was more that I wanted to see. And that had to do with having true power over voice and choice in what's happening to you. And I felt like one of the ways that we could do that was to actually put an app in young people's hands. And so I started this organization with the concept of first a website that would have videos around how to age out. But then it became so much clearer that we needed more than videos, that the intervention needed to be stronger. And so thought to myself, oh, how might you have an app that actually sets your own goals and tells your worker what your goal is? And then it became, well, you kind of need more than your worker to work on these goals. You need a personal advisory board who's going to coach you on how to learn how to drive, how to prepare for that interview, sit down with you and get that resume done. And so these functions were so critical that I said, oh, wow, we need to add this personal advisory board in. When we created that first couple of versions of our web platform, it became so clear to me that this was beyond just a technical problem of how do you get people's voices into their case plan. There was a fundamental flaw in the system that oppresses people to not actually have voice and choice. And even the illusion of voice and choice still doesn't equate to actual change in your life. And so that's when we realized we had to actually evolve our organization to be a systems change organization, where we're focusing on what parts of the system actually have to be re-architect in order to actually center the person with lived experience in their life in a way that we actually create the conditions around them where they're able to heal, develop, and truly be positioned to thrive.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. I like I like what you said, about highlighting the places that, in my own words, that aren't working, and haven't been working, and have been falling short or failing of some factor. And, presenting, not just, saying, oh, that's not working, but also presenting alternatives and showing the data behind it, which I've seen you guys do and so forth. So thank you for that. My next question, it kind of segues into the thing, so forgive me if it kind of seems like the same question, but why is this work important to yourself and to Think of Us? Like, why should people care?
Well, I think what's very unique about Think of Us is that we're not looking to be the largest provider of any service. A lot of nonprofits, you create a service that you're doing, whether that be coaching of transition age young people, resource navigation for kin, right? Licensing of foster parents. Well, you create something and then you look to get these contracts with government or get grants and do this work where you want to become the best and the baddest and the greatest at that service that you're providing. And that's one type of nonprofit. I'm very excited about the fact that we are an R&D lab. We are a research and development lab where we'll take on these projects, we'll take on a state contract for the purposes of understanding what works and doesn't work about that structure. And then once we learn what that structure is, it's about taking those insights along with the participatory research that we do, along with the data gathering that we do from the field, and bring that to the federal ecosystem. So we will bring those things to our biweekly meeting with the White House. We'll bring that to our conversations with the federal agency, and we'll bring that to Congress to change the laws. But the purpose here is to create things that enable and catapult other people's work, that allow us to change the way that the system is actually architect, so that then it has a new structure that will allow folks at the local level and at the state level to be able to be in service in such a radically different way.
Thank you. Thank you. My next question is, you guys have hit on a lot of different categories, as you have mentioned before. And just a couple, to mention, touching on the experience of COVID, throughout COVID, what was happening to youth and what needed to be addressed by the federal and state governments and so forth. And from there, you guys have advocated and built awareness around, stimulus for older youth and bringing income to those youth that were in care. Also, bringing awareness to the mental health, part of it, and also what we had talked about before, what is happening in these child care institutes, and so forth. So, if you can kind of break those down and kind of summarize, what was the mission behind those components, bringing awareness around what was happening to youth, taking on these CCIs, which are big money bringers in certain states and so forth that have been going on for years. I like to consider them like the old guard of child welfare and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I'll start with the group homes and then back into our pandemic work, which is when it comes down to the work we've done around group homes. When we started this journey, I was one who had more of a neutral feeling. I knew that group homes weren't a place that I wanted to be in. However, I have a little brother. I have 10 siblings, and one of them is, has had a lot of violent behaviors and a lot of challenges. And so I've always thought to myself, like, there might be the right group home for that type of intervention that's needed there. But then after going on this journey of understanding what are the experiences that young people were having there, was healing actually occurring? Was this truly an intervention? It really became clear, not just by just the science, but also through the lived experience of people, that this is not where we should be raising folks. And that when I looked at my brother's story, he entered a group home setting at the age of 9, and he had 1 year out of his whole time before he turned 18 where he lived in community. So when you look at between 9 and 18 and you spend 8 of those years in a group home setting, being institutionalized, not being loved, not having love beyond any contractual agreement, not being able to really be in a community where you can develop, your own ideologies and ideas of who you want to become, it becomes very clear that children shouldn't be raised in that type of environment. And so for me, I think a lot of people said, look, if you take this position, you're going to alienate states. If you take this position, you're going to make enemies with folks. And I think for us, it's just about doing the right thing around communicating that, look, children shouldn't be raised in here. And when we have interventions that exist, like, we should use them as interventions. But right now, what we know as a fact is that based on just the quantitative data, just the system data itself, is that there are states, like in the South, there's one state where 70% of all of their young people, teenagers who are in congregate care, their first night was in a group home. You cannot tell me that that was an intervention that you were able to figure out on the first night of their placement.
Wow. Wow. That takes me, I know, like, my experience, being, I actually experienced being on the juvenile side and the foster care side, but, and I say this a lot, reason I entered into the juvenile side is because of behaviors I exhibited. But those behaviors were side effects to the abuse, the sexual, the physical, the verbal, emotional abuse. And eventually, after asking for so much help from teachers, from other people, and falling on deaf ears, I numbed out. I stopped caring, and stop caring led me to, if somebody bullied me, I went overboard, and I didn't know how to stop, so that led me to getting suspended in school and all these other things. Next thing you know, I'm in juvenile, and eventually into the foster care system and so forth. So go ahead.
And I would just say, it's so interesting because society and how the system is structured expects us to say things like, oh, you didn't know how to stop. oh, you couldn't control yourself. When the reality is that these are perfect normative actual reactions to what's the input. The input of abuse, the input of violation, the input of distrust, the input of
Right.
being marginalized and oppressed. This is the reaction that those things cause. And in fact, maybe I would argue that this is not enough of a reaction to like what those things have actually instilled in people. And so when I think about the system, one of the fundamental flaws that I see in the system is that there is a high level of system induced trauma
Yes.
that is induced by the system, by having just the experience of being in it. There are things that should not happen as a result of something that's supposed to be intervening and supposed to be a positive experience, but yet it comes with these fundamental negative experiences that are wiring young people and families in a way that it is catastrophic and does have lifelong consequences to many people.
Definitely, definitely. And what we see is that re-traumatization, and that re-traumatization becomes to generational foster care, because now somebody has exited the system and they got re-traumatized instead of the time when they were supposed to be healed. And next thing you know, they have a kid and they're not doing what they need to do because they're not in that mental state to be able to take care of the kid, you
Well, I
know?
would argue that the over surveillance of our young people who are parents
Mm-hmm.
is part of the dynamic. So when I think about Nebraska, 33% of all their children under the age of 5 had a parent in the foster care system,
Wow.
right? That I look at how they have one of the highest rates of young parents in the country. You know, these are the things that make us say, what is actually going on here? So I think people tend to look and say, this is all on the individual, but so much of this is not the individual. It is the
Mm-hmm.
structure that we live in. And so when we do say, oh, we left our child at home that one time to run to the corner store, and that gets immediately reported, or we're being surveilled and that gets disclosed, you know, those can become potential removals. And so we're just under a microscope that is watching our every move.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, definitely, and that right there, you know, what factors into neglect when you ain't got nobody else, you know, and so forth, to help you take care of a kid, and so forth. That can be a podcast in itself,
Right.
in itself, because we know, as well as, you know, many other people in this field, that, you know, neglect looks differently, you know, in communities where you're a single parent, or you're a parent with low income, and you just don't have the means to be able to provide what is recommended at a state level, you know, and so forth. But the kid is getting taken care of, you know. But I've seen removals, you know, take place, for example, where um, a person had been in care, and um you know, a vindictive, you know, ex or parent, or, you know, whoever, you know, reported that they had been in care, and they had, you know, mental things and so forth. Now, for the rest of their experience, you know, there's going to be supervision over them. And what happens if anything else happens, they're going to take that kid no matter what, you know. And that's how do you live with that, you know, and so forth. And I'm a person, you know, that believes that, you know, how can you parent if you feel that everything that you do, every step that you take, um someone's going to try to take your kid, you know. So that, like I said, that's a subject in itself. Um, but I kind of want to, you know, bring us back, you know, to my question here. How does Think of Us and yourself plan to approach 2022? You know, what is next for you guys? What is the journey?
Yeah, I am so excited for this year. It represents a year where we are looking at multiple different projects, and we've been going through our strategic planning process, and we landed on a few things. And one of the big things that we landed on was that we would launch the Center for Lived Experience, a center that has three pillars: participatory data and research, that is literally aiming at how do we get lived experience data and insight from the people who actually go through the problem, who can share the nuances of their experiences in such a way that helps us better as an ecosystem solve problems. And then we looking at community building. How do we take those insights and not position it just to do work within Think of Us, but how do we enable others by understanding what we're understanding and provide them with some of the data that we have so that they can do their own synthesis, their own analysis, their own ability to say, you know, this is the patterns that we're seeing, and here's what we want to do in the world with that. And then the last part is proximate policymaking. The idea that, you know, as policy is being created right now, as we have opportunities to go ahead and have legislative change, regulatory change, and so forth, that we would go ahead and actually ensure that there's proximity between the decisions that are being made and the people with lived experience who experience these issues every day to ensure that we're not misstepping. Because so much of our actual system, it has been architected by well-intentions, and those well-intentions have been the pathway to actual disproportionality, oppression, and really have moved us away from actually doing well for young people and families.
Wow, wow. I'm excited. I'm excited to see what you guys bring and so forth. I came to know Think of Us through COVID, which was like a daunting experience in itself. But I've came to know, and I did my research and so forth, and I've been following you guys, and you to just see the momentum and work that you guys have put out in the midst of disaster for most organizations and so forth is admirable. And I just want to say, and I think I speak for a little most alumni and so forth, the work that you guys done about bringing awareness in that time, and all that you guys have done so far. Um, Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I also appreciate that. You know, I think, you know, when the pandemic hit, we as an organization were faced with the same question as many other organizations around sustainability, what would happen. And when the pandemic hit, while others were trying to have board meetings and get into planning mode and emergency planning, we just made a choice internally that we would go and give it everything that we got. We would hire up and be as useful as possible and let go of the idea of any of our traditional programming, any future programming, and just said, how do we show up in this very moment right now? And if we can be of value in this moment, it will be okay if we run out of money and have to shut down. It will be okay if this is what the closure of Think of Us was. And that's how we approached it. And so, as people kept in donating, we kept hiring more people with lived experience to publish guidance. We kept making ourselves so useful. And now we're 35 folks strong as a result of that very, moment where we just decided that we would show up and serve versus be worried about what our self-sustainability would look like.
Definitely. And I feel like in the midst of what you said is, a piece of advice for those nonprofit and organizations that are out there, and still wondering, just think of your vision, think of what you're working on, and just focus on that. At this point in time, we know that COVID is here, and it might not be going nowhere. And we live in a society where we've learned through history that this probably won't be the first. This isn't the first, and probably won't be the last pandemic. We've learned that through history and so forth. But what can we do in those moments that matter? For the people that we're serving and so forth. So, man, you kind of reached on my next question, so I'm gonna skip that. But what would you say? What is next out of the first item? What is next for yourself, and what is next for Think of Us?
Next for myself, I feel like one of the things that I'm coming up on is my 30th birthday, and it just is such a symbolic moment because I think for a while I've been doing this work, and people will continuously bring me to the table as the young person, right? And that's just not the narrative anymore. As a 30-year-old, I'm someone with lived experience and lived expertise. But I also, run a full-fledged organization that has conducted research, has conducted systems change, passed legislation, and so forth. And so I guess for me personally, it's the shifting of the internal self to be in the young adult seat as a 30-year-old. And then in terms of the company, we're hiring 9 positions. We're continuing to grow. We expect to double, in this year going into next year. And we're going to continue to lean in. Right now is the closest moment I feel like we will get to be able to do some monumental shifting. We are living in a time where Americans in general are saying, government is not working for me. These regulations are not working for me. These mandates are not working for me. Oh, they must not work for my neighborhood. They must not work for my city, for my state. And that type of energy is the fundamental energy to revolution. And so as people are doing historic investments in the infrastructure of the United States, as people are thinking through these other big reform efforts, how do we leverage that type of awokeness to be able to say child welfare should be different? And what should it look like? And for us, we're believing that that's rooted in making sure that we start centering kin and making sure that young people are connected to family way more than they've ever been connected before. And how do we support those families and be equitable with the resources and supports that we provide them? Because we'll provide foster parents a national average of $800 a month. But for many states, the majority of this country, we will not do the same for grandma, uncle, and aunt when they take in their relative. And so how do we change the conditions that we currently live in to be able to enable families to be able to take care of their loved ones?
Definitely, definitely. Thank you for that. So powerful. My next question, I didn't originally have this, but I think it's important to ask you this, and hopefully you're okay with me asking. Um, we know as well as many that diversity is a new thing, and to be not only a big face in child welfare now, but be a black man, a black male, in today's society, and having experience what racism in your experience of in your experience of care and so forth. Um, what does it mean to you to be in this position, to reform, to change, to advocate, and build awareness, and have a more powerful voice than before, as a black man?
I was 15 years old when I was at the bus stop, and it was one of the points where I had just hit an all-time low. It was after 2 years of having open and closed investigations, around the abuse I was going through. I was just tired, and I was starting to get to that very much hopeless point. And I remember, and one of the things I would do to keep myself going is that every morning I would have my MP3 player and I would have my gospel music and I would listen to that music, and it kept me. And that was the true, support that I needed to be able to navigate some of the things I was going through. And one of the prayers that I just prayed that day was like, if, and I prayed to God and I said, let me, have a life where I can use it in service to solve some of these problems, these very, to solve some of these problems, these very hard problems that we're going through. And that allows me to that's where I was then. Today, I have to say, I feel like I'm living in that truth. And I'm living in that truth beautifully, not because I'm the smartest or because it's about me, but because what we do in 80% of our work is find what others are doing so well and help figure out how do we help be catalytic in that, either by adding technology to it or by helping redesign with lived experience at the center of it, by making sure that we promote the right things up. Like this is the fundamental kind of, change work where you get to be catalytic to stuff. So I feel like I'm living, what I had prayed for.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you for that. Um, and I know I've said this a lot, but it is such an honor to be able to speak to you today. And I appreciate it, because as a person myself that's been doing advocacy, I started advocating at 15, and I'm still advocating now. It's like 10 years of experience advocating at the state and a national level and so forth. Being a Black male, doing this work, it, you don't see a lot, and it took a while for people to hear me and so forth. So I just, look to you and your journey, and like, well, and as many other people, I'm pretty sure Sixto can do it. I
Mhm.
can too, you know. And I just appreciate you for giving, that pathway, you know. And so forth. My last question for us today is, what tips and tidbits could you give to youth in care and alumni out of care?
Yeah, I would say, the storm doesn't last your entire life. And that's such an important thing, but it will last for a while. And so while it lasts in this while, to really know that like the pain is real and that you will need to go on that healing journey, but to surround yourself with people who are pushing you towards that healing and towards that evolution. Because unlike other traumatic experiences that tend to be short in time, not all of them, but a good majority of like, car accidents and things of that nature, they're short traumatic experiences that still may have a long recovery. This one's unique in the sense that you have long endurance of that trauma, and you have long tail of that, what that recovery looks like. So taking care of yourself, understanding that like this is a marathon. And I always used to do this thing where I just never ask myself why. When you get into the why means, when you get into the why this has to happen to me, it just puts you in a very dark place. So I used to just have a rule that I didn't ask myself those questions, but it was, where do I go from here?
Thank you, and thank you for being on with me today. Thank you for taking some
Pleasure
time
is
out.
mine.
you know, um, in starting this, I didn't know if I would have even one guest and so forth, and just reaching out, and I appreciate you responding back. Um, and I hope for the listeners today, that through Sixo's experience, and expertise and wisdom and knowledge, that it you guys have something to take away from this, and just build upon it, and that's one of the biggest things why I brought this podcast here, is to be able to bring people who have lived through it, bring people who are just stakeholders and community leaders too, though, and showcase all those voices, in hopes that it may educate, bring up reform, help in advocacy, and just, change the tide of what's happening now, and change the narrative for some people. So thank you guys for listening. I appreciate, all the support and so forth. You guys know my spiel, as I say it all the time. COVID is here. It ain't going nowhere. I believe we on our third, fourth variant, so um if you guys are, vaccinated, or even thinking about being vaccinated still, do your research, don't procrastinate about it, get it done. If you guys aren't, that is your choice. But for both, if you're vaccinated or not vaccinated, please continue to wear your mask, continue to be safe, continue to take the right precautions and so forth. Because it takes all of us. We all are this one big community and village. So, by you just taking care of yourself, being safe, you're taking care of this big old village. And you guys have a great night, a great morning, a great whenever you guys are listening to this. Thank you again. This is Resilient Voices and Beyond.